Hey, I'm Alan Furstenberg,
And I'm Noble Ackerson,
and welcome back to Two Voice Devs.
two voice devs.
Noble, man, it is always fantastic to have you on. I've lost count of the number of times you've been on an episode. We've done live stuff together. It's always great to have you here and get your insights.
Always a pleasure to chop it up with you, Alan. And whenever we get to do it live, it's even better.
Oh
And
man,
hopefully
yes.
we get to do that more often.
And hopefully we will. And one of the great reasons is you've gotten some fantastic news recently.
That's right. I am returning to the Google Developers Experts Program, this time under the artificial intelligence category. And so I get to do things like this and educate the community and learn myself from brilliant people like Alan and all the brilliant GDEs globally. So yeah,
Well, and I think I've said this before. That is one of the great things about the GDE program is that we're able to tap into this worldwide set of resources and other people,
all right,
some of whom just truly blow me away. I've got
preach.
we've had multiple GDEs on before. It's fantastic. I really want to get some Microsoft MVPs on because I know they're also going to be wonderful.
Right, right.
Um,
Does Amazon have an equivalent to the
they do.
Champions program or
They
something?
have the AWS Champions program.
Right, right. Yeah. So yeah,
Um,
diversify that.
yep. So we like getting lots of different people, different perspectives on, but I also love having you on because I love your perspectives on stuff. And more importantly, I love discussing and debating your perspectives on stuff because I learn a
That's
whole
right.
lot when we do so.
Likewise.
So let's get into it. When we were talking about what to talk about, you had just done a video about generative UI, so a generative user interface.
Hmm.
And I've recently discussed this with Lee Malin. He and I didn't quite agree. I liked your take on it. Why don't you explain it again and let's see if you can win me over.
Okay. No promises. So one one common misconception or just a mistake is to conflate generative UI or generative user interfaces with generative AI aided user interface generation, if that makes any sense. So being able to sort of generate user interfaces with generative AI, totally different things, maybe a
Okay.
subtle distinction based on what you may be thinking, but AI aided design is not generative UI, and I can define Gen UI if you want.
Yes. Oh, definitely yes.
Okay. So I'll take the Nielsen Norman groups, and I don't endorse those guys, but I'll take their definition of it. They define it as a user interface that is dynamically generated in real time by an AI, LLMs, to provide an experience customized to fit the user's need and context. So that's sort of I said it slow enough that
Okay.
I hope I didn't muck that up. But
So
okay, go ahead.
so the user's need and context.
Mhm.
To me, that feels like the operative words here.
Right.
And I love that notion. I feel like I like this in concept. But when
Right.
I start thinking about what that means, where
Okay.
my brain jumps to are things like um, dynamic menus, so that the menus that we see will change depending on the context of what we're doing. Depending on the screen of what we're in, the menus will change. Or that if I don't use a feature, it will remove it from the menu because I never used the feature. So, it hides it. Or a settings screen where it only puts the settings I play with the most on the first screen, or, stuff like that. Is that
Mhm.
what you mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you just nailed different kinds of dynamically generated interfaces, right? And their various, we can talk about what it looks like in practice, so maybe that can sort of elucidate, like that kind of blow it up a little bit. But I think you nailed it. Right now, traditional UI, if I click on a settings button, or a menu, like you say, it's deterministic, right? It
Mhm.
shows a settings menu, right? In that, it responds to triggers, it follows a predetermined path, it is static decision rules. Nothing wrong with that. And I think that it's rule based, it's reactive. That will always be needed for websites, for dashboards, for that kind of stuff. However, what I'm talking about, what NN Group or what folks who tend to talk about generative UI is trying to talk about is when a user seems to be looking for, say, temperature controls, right? You know, how can the system proactively offer thermostat options? So I'm in my
Okay.
mind's eye, I'm thinking about Nest interface because
Yeah.
that's literally sitting
Uh,
on my screen here, looking at my security cameras. But think about it. How do you take advantage of an LLM's representation of meaning in context learning to anticipate needs based on the context that you've either derived through to some user preference, a user input, a behavior pattern, to adapt and change the conditions of the UI, as I think you were alluding to, and then in doing so leverage some of the strengths of a good modern reasoning LLM, have it set an objective or reason through what the outcome would be, evaluate multiple approaches, pick the right component if you're building this as a web application, and then stream that back to the user in near real time, if not real time, right? It's a lot packed
no,
in
it
there.
it is a lot. I feel like I feel like my frustration on this topic comes from kind of twofold. One is what you just described to me
Mhm.
sounds an awful lot like a conversational user interface,
Right.
and
How
I think
how
that's
so?
awesome.
Can do you explain that? I love
So
that.
this is a notion that we've had with voice interfaces for 7, 10 plus years. Is the fact that I don't necessarily have a fixed set of menu items that I am following, but that I have this natural speech. I am conversationally engaging with my device. Now, that conversation may take several forms. Traditionally, we think of it as voice, but we've also talked about how it could be a chatbot, it could be voice and gestures, it could be voice and screens. It can and should be multimodal. The responses that come back, you know, it's
Mhm.
not necessarily the system talking back to us, but it does mean that we've got this real time action taking place. If I say, turn on the lights, the response to that is turning the light on. It doesn't
Right.
need to be, I have turned the light on. So I like your example there. Where where I feel like I have problems with it is when we say things like, on a website, um, actually the scenario I described, where the menus are going to change, the location of a button is going to change, where, I have an issue with that because when I think about how I've helped somebody else use a website,
Mhm.
I need to be able to say, click here, click here, click here. And
Right.
if I say click here, and they say that option doesn't appear on my menu,
Mhm.
and it doesn't appear on their menu because they've never used it before, we now have
Right.
a communication problem.
That's absolutely true. What you're describing, I'm going to sort of counter that or help you and your audience out in a couple ways. What you're describing has actually been an opportunity, I'll call it, for a long time.
It's
If
not a
you
bug, it's a
remember,
feature.
it's a feature. And by the way, before I even go into sort of breaking this down, I just want to say, first of all, preamble before anything else, just because we're advocating for hyper personalized user interfaces and dynamically generated components streaming back to an interface does not mean design patterns that are age old, that
Mm,
reduce the cognitive load because we know that this is a mobile app and these are the patterns that I expect to My thumb has a radius by which I know that primary action buttons need to be able to be clicked with one hand. None of that should change. Again, this reminds me of back in the day when uh, Flash, Adobe, Macromedia. I'm
Uh-huh.
older. I'm my Macromedia years old. I'm very old. Um, when Macromedia introduced Flash, that was a powerful way to deliver what we called rich internet applications, and that was abused. That
Yes.
became Flash, because it was such a wide canvas, figuratively and almost literally speaking. It allowed the creativity of folks to not follow standards, and the UX patterns were avoided. For every website, there was a movie trailer intro, even if I was selling pets food or something like that. No, I would advocate very strongly that your usability, accessibility, user experience, just product sense, understanding what your user needs should always remain constant. So that's my preamble to
Okay.
counter the notion that when we say dynamically generated, menus change. That is just jarring, and nobody wants that.
So what does a generative UI feel like when we're talking about
Mhm.
a generative web UI? Now, okay, so
Got it.
I'm gonna concede right off the bat. Conversational, absolutely. If we're talking conversation, if we're talking voice, if we're talking chatbots, I get that, and I think most people at this point get what that feels like and how an AI fits into that. I feel
Mhm.
like I'm on much shakier ground thinking, how does an AI fit into other UI paradigms? How does it fit into
Got it.
my dynamic menu? How does it fit into, I don't know.
So let's talk about how that works. So to do that, let's look at traditional applications one more time.
Sure.
When we build an interface, when we build our tools, our dashboards at work, it's one size fits all. And I'm not talking about the data being piped onto the interface. I'm talking about the structure of the interface. It's one size fits all. Navigation paths are designed for the average user. Again, if I click a settings page, I know that I get the view. It forces users adapt to an interface, and that has a lot of benefits, as you alluded to there,
Yes.
because
But
I know I know that that's on the left. And frankly, a well-designed generative UI should stick to that. Okay? You
okay.
shouldn't change the location of a primary action or even a secondary action, but the information tailored to the end user's outcome, or what your system, the LLM, and your tooling perceives as the end user's goal, whether it be the user's intent, whether it be the user's previous preference, or even recommendation system like lookalike data, to help fast track a user from need to done, from action to value, from I need a widget to I got my widget. All right. So for these
Okay.
modern user needs, what I've been researching, my applied research has been focused on answering a couple questions. How do I provide context specific information access without jarring experience that we just talked about? How do I provide, how do I infer the role of the user, the persona, and their typical tasks in order to sort of display it in an intuitive way? Again, to fast track their time to value. And then how do I learn from that and then continuously adapt to the user? An example that I always use is more in the enterprise side, because that's where my applied research is currently focused. And so if I am a salesperson and I tend to use a business intelligence interface, BI dashboards suck, but just for the sake of conversation, if every single time I come to that dashboard, I go through my filter, I get my region data, and I export it as a table, why go through that 7 clicks? Why go through those 7 clicks or 5 steps and filters and different sub dashboards? Why not just surface that information when they need it and then out of the way when they don't?
Ooh, I saw what you did there. That will be another conversation soon, I hope.
That
Um,
would be another. So,
I
so that's what I'm
uh,
trying to play upon, right? Like, how do I understand, use the context on a page to deliver and some context about that user embedded, and I'll walk through how I do that, um, in order
so
to
I
sort of fast track them. Yeah.
so I think I get it, and it occurs to me now, this really does tap into one of the things that I hate the most is, if I'm going and looking at, my Google Cloud bill, for example, the
Hmm.
first thing I always do is, I go to a particular page, and mind you, it's not the first page I go to. I can never remember which one it is. So usually I click like 3 or 4 times till I get to the right page.
Right.
I go to that page, I then click on the products, I then unclick several of the products because I don't care about those. And I do the same thing every single
Every
time.
single time. Every single time. And then
So
frankly,
so it feels like what a generative UI would do isn't saying it would close those out. It isn't saying it would move any of those checkboxes, any of those menu items. It wouldn't. But when I go to the site, it would know 90% of the time I'm going to this page and I'm clicking all of those things. So it should take me to that page with those things unclicked by default.
that's
Okay.
right. I just gave a talk at a conference in Arlington, Virginia. Did a whole, it's not a talk, like a workshop on how to build these things. And I walked the audience through sort of a 6 stage pipeline. The 6 stages of how all of this magic works, if you want to look at it that way, is, first, understanding the user's intent. And how do we do that? This is either user context. So, Alan always goes to the finance page and gets this information. And so that's essentially a form of user input capture on the client side. Okay. That then I get it gets embedded and all that stuff. But the second stage is some sort of state management, where I'm basically processing context. And this is often on the server side, right? And then right after that, I'm passing that on to a streaming service for an LLM to eventually, number four, reason through what the user's context was or what the user's intent was, have it reason through an objective, decide on what visualization based on the data available, and what components are available. And I'll get into component recognition in a second. And then number five, define any tools that, or make some tool calls, which are basically calling a component that makes sense for the task. So then we just call we call the component and say this person needs a pie chart for this type of need, or this person needs this FinOps table to provide their billing information when they take these sets of action. Then you hand that over to our component stream, pick the component or the tool back to the end user. So essentially, I'm sort of skirting on not using the word agents here, but essentially it is an agentic workflow, because it's not just, you know, Leroy Jenkins just going out and just doing its own thing. I'm putting it on rails, essentially. What's happening is
Hang on a minute. That's interesting that you say you're putting it on rails
right.
because the number of people that talk about agents as being not on rails, agents are they're free agents. They roam, they do stuff. They do whatever. They're all powerful acting on your behalf. So I like the fact that what you're actually saying, I think this is actually more accurate about what agents are like today, is you're saying we have defined very, very narrow categories,
Hmm.
or maybe even not so narrow categories, but we've still defined categories
Hmm.
that an agent can work in. and we've
Right.
given it specific ways that it can work.
Right.
And then within those boundaries, we turn it
Right.
loose.
Spot on.
I
Spot on.
like how you put that.
Right. So essentially what I'm doing here is, before, what happens, especially if you're using an off the shelf model, um, you quickly realize in real world uses that often the LLM reasons fairly accurately as to what the intent is versus what tool to match it with, right? However, when generating the right visualization, and again, I'm just looking at a dashboard as an example here,
Hmm.
and I'll explain why in a second. It's always screws that last part out. So essentially, one agent is doing the reasoning part. It's just an LLM reasoning call. It's just a function with a bunch of doc strings telling it exactly what to do. A doc string in a function. So it's not really complicated at all. And it's again part of a workflow, which then hands off to another agent that is going to pick a tool. And by the way, I'm not defining agents like others are. I'm just defining agents in the simplest way. Ability to reason, ability to call a function or a tool, and a loop. That's
That's
it.
pretty much how everyone else is defining it.
Okay. So
More,
those are
with variants, but we'll go with that definition for now. I like that.
yeah, yeah. I love that. That's Anthropic's way to define it. Everything else is noise, right? And agency and all that. No, it's just, is it using you know, the backprop
It's
strength of the model,
I,
and can it pick a tool if it's like like a Gemini
right.
2.5 kind of
I
caliber? Yeah.
I look at it in terms of, and we've got other shows on this, and we'll be doing many more shows, I'm sure. I look at it in terms of, is there something that picks a tool based on arbitrary input? And
Hmm.
that may be a combination of a large language model, it may be a combination of fixed business rules,
Hmm.
but there's something that makes a decision, and there is something that executes it within fixed boundaries, i.e.,
Right.
the tool calling.
Right.
And then you keep doing that. That to
Right.
me is, and then it evaluates the result of the tool call or the result of either one. Maybe it loops, maybe it doesn't loop, you know, but
Right.
fundamentally, that's what it boils down to.
Spot on. And the tools for me for generative UI are essentially the core, the heartbeat of UI generation, right? Each tool represents a capability. Um, Basically how our AI can choose that capability, or that component in our case to use. I have, and then as part of that tool call, I have a generate function. I think I have, and I can sort of share that later. That returns, in my case, a React component, but it always croaks when you try to challenge it. Let's say I throw at it kurtosis, or I throw at it a whisker chart, and it's really the world model, or the base model, or the instruction tune model doesn't really know that, like how recharts or D3 or Tremor does that. That's when I start thinking maybe this is one use case where we need to fine tune on components synthetically, and or just an SFT based on synthetic data that
So,
is tuned to these components that I care about.
so two things here. One is I think we want to take up that tuning part another
Hmm.
time.
Yep.
So I don't want to go too far into that one right now. But part of me is saying, well, wait a minute. If what we're doing is we're defining functions, so we've got a
Hmm.
function that's defined called set chart type, and it
Okay.
takes enumerated parameters of bar chart, line chart, scatter plot. We enumerate all the different chart types. We can do that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Why is that falling down? Where
Because
is, yeah.
there's some combinations, and actually, can I answer that by showing? So the question was, why does it fall over in production, right? Like, why does
Yeah.
it? Because, one, because humans and non-deterministic systems mean magic. Things happen when you haven't planned it. And so let's do this. I'm going to keep this simple. I want to see which devices use the most electricity in my home. And I have my smart TV, but this is a table, and I don't want it as a table. Alan, I'm going to sound like a P.T. Barnum magician here. Give me a visualization that will better represent this type of data.
So I want to see that as a pie chart.
Everyone says pie chart initially.
Well, that's because you've got percentages there. It's an obvious one.
I know. So I don't have any, this is the same component. I don't have any pie chart components or whatever piping the data for that. This is dynamically generated, and my interface is kind of semi broken. Forgive me,
So so
but
hang so
I'm going
hang
to
on a
take it a
second.
step further. Uh-huh.
Hang on. When you say this interface is dynamically generated,
Yep.
you were I mean, what got passed back? Python?
JavaScript.
Okay.
It's basically a JSON object with what the LLM reasoned through,
Okay.
chose what it understood from a library that it had been trained on, or that it
Okay.
knows by default, and knows how to manipulate that library. So it then changed the parameters and the type to pi, and then the make. So if, say, for example, I want a variant of a pie chart as a donut chart, I just say donut. By the way, this is also stateful. So I don't, it's kind of like a conversational AI. I'm going to say, give me this as a table.
Oh, no, before you give
And
this to
then
me as
one,
a
eh,
table, bef- before you, okay, give it to me as a table. Sure.
go ahead.
I was
I
going to
said, give
say,
it to me as time. Hmm.
well, let's bring the pie chart back up for a second first, because
Okay.
I want to see what it reacts to. Ooh,
Okay.
nice history here, like this. Okay. Um, can you give it instructions like um use warm colors?
No, let's see. So it's invoked another tool that I haven't tested yet
And I guess why I asked that was,
for accessibility.
well, it says, I mean, that was part of it, but also to see kind of where those decisions were being made. Because, you could have
You
defined at
know,
some level,
right, right,
here's
right, right, right.
here's the set of colors that to use, or the library could have defined here's the set of colors to use. And did it have control over changing that set of colors?
So give me an obscure, I want to show your audience an obscure one that for sure breaks it. Not like tributes, but a different visualization.
You got me trying to think of a really good and confusing things. Something good and confusing. Devices that tend to run in the winter. Try that.
But that's not a visualization.
No, I suppose not. What were you going to put in?
Temperature history for today. Let's see. Shows that. So by default, it might, okay. So this is a regular bar chart. So or some sort of temporal chart. Um,
That looks like a high-low chart, vaguely.
as a whisker plot, I think is the word, not chart. Anyway, what was the whole point of showing you this?
I had said, um, if we're defining the functions and we're defining what the values of the parameters of the functions are, where does it fall down? You're saying it falls down. Where does it fall down, or why does it fall down?
And we'll talk about this. Um, this is an example of when it falls over, right? So I've given it a whisker chart. The Gemini model that is running this thing has not it hasn't been generalized on whisker charts enough. Right now, it's giving me whatever this is. It's not that, this is definitely not a whisker plot.
No.
And so what needs to happen is something that we'll talk about in a future episode, where we fine tune on, um, a bunch of components
Okay.
lining it with.
So we'll pick this up. So we'll pick that part of it up another time.
Yep.
I want to get back to so the issue is that when you were asking for a whisker chart, what it returned was something else. It returned different parameters or parameters that
Right.
didn't make sense for
Right.
that particular.
r-
That's interesting.
Right. And that's just a hallucination. That's that
Right.
we're very familiar with that.
I was going to say you and I
And
are very familiar with this one.
right. And so just like any way, you don't solve hallucination problems with fine tuning. You probably can improve the rate of hallucination by fine tuning. You can improve the hallucination by better context that you provided as input. You can improve it by using a better model. In this case, I decided to, this is an older version of the app. This is being served right now on the web. I don't have my local machine here, but you would imagine a fine-tuned model would their the fine-tuned model trained on the typical components essentially teaches the old model new tricks, essentially not new knowledge, but just basically new patterns that it needs to unlock in order to deliver a whisker plot instead of whatever this is.
Okay. So
Hmm.
we're at the point where we need to teach it new vocabulary.
Hmm.
We need to enhance it in that way. I think we're going to pause here and we will take this up another time on Two Voice Devs.
Two voice devs.
Noble, great to have you on this week. I look forward to continuing this conversation.
I will always be here looking to nerd out more on generative UI. Yeah, sure.